On the night of November 12, 1970, the sea rose over the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta and killed between 300,000 and 500,000 people. The number has never been established with precision because the places where most of those people lived were washed away along with them, and the systems that might have counted them before and after did not extend into the islands and mudflats of the delta at any level of reliability that a precise count would require. What is known with precision is this: the Bhola cyclone was the deadliest tropical cyclone in the recorded history of the world at the time it struck, and the warning that it was coming had been transmitted on national radio for days. East Pakistan, in November of 1970, was a country inside a country, a political arrangement whose geography made it, by any conventional analysis, an anomaly. It shared no border with West Pakistan. It was separated from West Pakistan by nearly 2,000 kilometers of Indian territory. Its population was approximately 75 million people, which made it more populous than West Pakistan. Its land was the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Delta, one of the most complex and productive river systems in the world, and also one of the most exposed to the cyclones that form over the Bay of Bengal between October and December of each year. The delta that East Pakistan occupied was not a stable geographic feature. It was a landscape in continuous creation. The rivers that drained the Himalayan snowmelt brought with them sediment that accumulated on the floor of the Bay of Bengal in quantities large enough to create new land, islands called chars, at a pace that human settlement followed almost immediately. People moved onto newly emerged chars because the fresh silt soil was extraordinarily productive. Rice, jute, and vegetables grew with an abundance that newly formed delta land produced, and that the older, more depleted land further inland could not match. The communities that formed on the newest chars were communities of recent arrivals, families from the older, more crowded mainland districts of East Pakistan who had heard that land was appearing in the estuary and who had moved their households, their agricultural tools, and their livestock to claim a plot. They built houses from bamboo and compressed mud brick, with tin roofs when they could afford them, positioned as far from the water's edge as the available land allowed. They planted rice in the wet season and grew vegetables and pulses in the dry season. They caught fish in the rivers and channels that divided one char from the next. They sent their jute to market by boat along routes that had become established over the years they had been there. Their children attended schools where such schools had been built, which in the newer chars meant schools that were themselves recent structures of bamboo and corrugated tin, staffed by teachers who had also recently arrived and who taught classes that assembled children whose parents had come from a dozen different mainland districts. They had created communities from nothing in the space of a few years or a decade, and those communities had the character of places that were still in the process of becoming permanent. The chars filled up with people willing to accept the vulnerability that came with farming land barely above the level of the sea. In the delta, the question of whether your island would survive a major cyclone was not theoretical.
Every community that had been there long enough had stories of storms that had reshaped the islands, raised the water to levels that destroyed everything, and receded, leaving the landscape changed and the people who had not fled reduced in number. The knowledge existed. The capacity to leave when a specific storm was coming was much more limited than the knowledge itself. The Bay of Bengal is warm in November. It is warm because the seasonal geometry of the monsoon leaves the northern part of the bay with water temperatures that generate and sustain tropical cyclones through the autumn months. And the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta sits at the northern end of the bay like the narrow end of a funnel. Cyclones that form in the central bay and move northward do not dissipate as they approach the coast. The shallow water of the continental shelf in the northern bay amplifies the storm surge rather than absorbing it.
A cyclone of moderate intensity making landfall at the head of the funnel pushes a wall of water northward that has nowhere to go except over the land. The funnel shape of the bay concentrates the surge. The flatness of the delta provides nothing to stop it. These were not new observations in 1970. British colonial administration of Bengal had produced a literature on the cyclones and storm surges of the Bay of Bengal that went back to the 18th century. The 1970 cyclone season had already produced several storms tracked by the Pakistan Meteorological Department. The department's headquarters were in Karachi in West Pakistan, and its monitoring infrastructure included weather ships, land stations, and access to satellite imagery that the United States Weather Satellite Network was providing to meteorological services around the world.
By November 8th, 4 days before the landfall of Bhola, the Pakistan Meteorological Department had identified a low-pressure system in the Bay of Bengal with the characteristics of a developing tropical cyclone. By November 10th, it was a full cyclone with sustained winds above 90 kilometers per hour. By November 11th, it had intensified further, and its track pointed toward the northern bay and the delta of East Pakistan. The warnings were broadcast. Radio Pakistan, the national broadcaster, transmitted cyclone warnings for the coastal areas of East Pakistan from November 10th onward. The warnings identified the storm's location, its intensity, and its projected track. They advised coastal populations to seek higher ground and to move away from exposed areas. They were accurate in their meteorological content. The problem was not the accuracy of the warnings.
The problem was the distance between the medium carrying the warnings and the people the warnings were intended to reach. The Chars of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta in 1970 were not communities where radio ownership was common. The percentage of households with a working radio in the rural delta was, by the estimates of Pakistani government surveys from the period, well below 10%. The communication infrastructure that reached the islands and mudflats was the infrastructure of a society organized around subsistence agriculture and river transport, word of mouth along the boat routes, the announcements of local government officials when those officials could be reached, the practical knowledge of fishermen who watched the sky and the sea with the accumulated expertise of a lifetime. Radio Pakistan's warnings, broadcast in Urdu and Bengali, reached the coastal towns, the administrative centers, the offices of the local government. They reached the district headquarters and the offices of the union councils that were the lowest formal level of administrative organization in rural East Pakistan. They did not reliably reach the fishermen on Manpura Island or the farmers on the Chars of the Meghna estuary who were going to sleep on the night of November 12th with their families in the houses they had built from bamboo, mud, and tin, 2 meters above the sea. The Pakistan Meteorological Department also issued a signal that rated the storm on a numerical scale of danger. The signal broadcast for the coastal areas of East Pakistan on November 11th and 12th was a 10 on a scale that ran to 11. A 10 was defined as indicating very intense danger. The highest possible level, 11, had never been issued. Beyond the radio broadcasts and the numbered signal, the infrastructure for communicating emergency warnings to the population of the remote Chars in 1970 was essentially the infrastructure of a pre-modern communication system. Messengers on foot and by boat, announcements through local mosques, word passed from household to household by whoever was moving between settlements. The East Pakistan government had no cyclone shelters in the most affected areas. The concept of a cyclone shelter, a building designed and designated specifically for the purpose of providing refuge from a major storm, was not part of the infrastructure investment that the central government had made in East Pakistan's Delta region in the 2 decades since independence. Shelters existed in some parts of India's Bengal coast, built by the colonial administration in response to earlier catastrophic cyclones. They did not exist at any significant scale in East Pakistan.
The question of whether the East Pakistani population would have evacuated in larger numbers if the warning had reached them more effectively was examined by Pakistani government inquiries in the months following the storm. The conclusion those inquiries produced was that many people in the affected areas had heard that a storm was coming, but had not believed or had not been able to act on the belief that the storm would be worse than the storms they had experienced before. The psychological dimension of the warning failure was real. A population that had survived previous cyclones and remained on the Chars had a lived experience that told them storms could be managed in place, because surviving the previous storms was the experience that their presence there documented. A radio signal or a local official's announcement saying that this storm was different required people to act against the evidence of their own survival history. Some did, many did not.
The local government officials who received the 10 signal through the administrative communication system had access to information that the population of the Chars did not. What they did with that information varied. Some officials organized local warning systems, moving through their areas by boat or on foot to alert households. The logistics of doing this effectively across the chars, many of which were accessible only by water, and many of which were hours of boat travel from any official with the authority and the knowledge to direct an evacuation, were daunting under the best conditions. The night of November 12th did not provide the best conditions. The sea had been rough since the 11th. The winds were already building before the cyclone arrived. The boats that would have been needed to move people from the lowest-lying chars to whatever higher ground existed were the same boats that were pitching and rolling in the deteriorating sea. The cyclone made landfall near the Meghna estuary at approximately 11 in the evening on November 12th. The sustained winds at landfall were approximately 185 kilometers per hour. The storm surge that the cyclone drove ahead of it reached heights of between 6 and 9 meters in the most exposed areas of the estuary. The surge arrived at night, at high tide, and it arrived at a speed that gave the people who had not moved before dark a few minutes of warning at most. The accounts of survivors from Manpura Island and the surrounding chars were collected in the weeks and months following the storm by Pakistani government officials, foreign journalists, and aid workers. They described the arrival of the surge in consistent terms that reflect the physical reality of what a 6-meter wall of water moving at high speed looks and sounds like at night. The survivors who were found alive in the days following the storm were predominantly people who had been in trees when the water came, or on the rooftops of the few structures built of brick or reinforced concrete. The school buildings, the mosques, the police stations, the government offices that the East Pakistani administration had managed to construct in the more established settlements. These buildings were not designed as cyclone shelters. They were simply heavier and taller than the surrounding residential structures. Their rooftops became platforms on which people waited for the water to recede, watching the current carry away the material remains of their community. Several survivors from the more exposed chars described reaching high ground, a tree, a roof, with their children, and then watching the water rise above the height of the people who had not reached any elevation.
The speed of the surge, in the accounts collected afterward, was the most disorienting element. Not a flood that rose gradually through the night, but a surge that arrived as a physical mass, audible in the dark before it was visible, and that reached the height of the houses and then the height of the trees in minutes rather than hours. The time available for decision after the first sound of the approaching water was, in the most exposed locations, measured in seconds rather than minutes. On Manpura Island, a char at the head of the Meghna estuary with a population of approximately 100,000 people, the water rose to the rooftops of the houses. The survivors who were found in the days following the cyclone were the people who had been in trees or on the rooftops of the few buildings, schools, mosques, government offices that were constructed of materials strong enough to survive the surge. The accounts collected from survivors in the weeks after the storm described the arrival of the water as something different from the flooding they had experienced in ordinary monsoon years. Not a gradual rise, but a wall, arriving with noise, carrying debris, moving fast enough that running in the dark was not meaningfully different from standing still. The mortality rate on Manpura Island in the Bhola cyclone was estimated at approximately 45% of the population. Other chars in the estuary had higher rates. The communities on the lowest and most recently formed land, where the people who had moved most recently lived in the most temporary structures, had the least warning and the highest mortality. The people who lived furthest from the shore and on slightly higher ground, and in the delta, slightly higher meant 1 or 2 meters, survived in higher proportions.
The difference between survival and death across the hundreds of thousands of people who lived in the path of the surge was often measured in those 1 or 2 meters. The morning of November 13th brought a sky that the survivors described as clear and blue, without the clouds of the preceding days, without wind, without any meteorological sign that distinguished it from an ordinary November morning over the Bay of Bengal. The cyclone had passed. The water had receded. What remained visible was the inventory of destruction. No houses, no trees, no animals, no boats, no infrastructure. In some areas, no living people visible to the eye in any direction. The relief workers and journalists who reached the most affected islands in the days following the storm described landscapes that bore no resemblance to the inhabited terrain that had been there before. The shapes of some chars had changed. Land that had existed was now underwater. The boundary between where the island had ended and where the bay began had moved in ways that the survivors, who had grown up knowing every detail of the terrain they lived on, found disorienting in addition to devastating. Trees that had been landmarks, the coconut palms and beetle palms that defined the boundaries of fields and the approaches to settlements, were gone. The paths between settlements were covered by mud deposited by the receding surge. The locations of houses were identifiable only by the fragments of bamboo and corrugated tin that remained in the mud, and in some cases, not at all. On Manpura Island, the police station and the school, both brick structures, had become the centers around which the survivors gathered. The station's upper floor and the school's roof had functioned as the primary refuges during the surge for people who had reached them in time.
In the days following the storm, these buildings became the distribution points for the first relief supplies that arrived by boat, the medical treatment centers for the injured, and the collection points for information about who had survived and who had not. The process of determining who had survived was the process of accounting for who was not present. Family members asking about neighbors, survivors comparing notes about who they had seen in the last days before the storm and who had not appeared since. The Bay of Bengal had a history with storms of this type. The records of cyclones making landfall in the Bengal Delta extended back through British colonial administration to the 18th century, and the pattern they documented was consistent. Major cyclones struck the delta at intervals of years to decades, killing tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, depending on the intensity of the storm and the density of the population in its path.
The 1970 storm was the largest in recorded history, but it was not the first. The previous major cyclone to strike the East Pakistan coast with catastrophic effect had been in 1960. That storm had killed approximately 10,000 people. The one before that, in 1941, had killed approximately 15,000. The history of cyclone mortality in the Bengal Delta was a history of numbers that declined as preparedness infrastructure improved and that climbed again when a storm exceeded the capacity of that infrastructure, or when the infrastructure had not been built.
In 1970, after 23 years of Pakistani rule, the preparedness infrastructure for the Chars of East Pakistan consisted primarily of the warning system that had failed to reach most of the population it was designed to protect, and the knowledge of the population itself, which was substantial but could not substitute for the physical structures and evacuation systems that would have allowed that knowledge to translate into survival. The count of the dead began immediately and never really ended, because the conditions that would have allowed a precise count did not exist. The census records for the affected areas were in district offices that had themselves been flooded. The local government officials who would have conducted the count were in some cases among the dead. The boats needed to reach the most isolated chars were in many cases the boats that had been destroyed.
The international and Pakistani press journalists who arrived in the days following the storm found communities where the surviving fraction of the population had no systematic way of knowing how many of their neighbors and family members had died. They had direct knowledge of deaths they had witnessed or that had been reported to them by other survivors. They had no mechanism for extending that knowledge to a total. The Pakistan government's estimates of the death toll in the days and weeks following the cyclone started at around 5,000 in the first official communications and climbed as the scale of the disaster became apparent. By the end of November, the official Pakistani government figure had reached approximately 200,000. Subsequent estimates from international organizations, from Pakistani government inquiries, and from academic demographers produced ranges between 300,000 and 500,000. The figure that has been most widely cited in the historical literature is 500,000. The relief effort that followed the storm was inadequate by any measure that could be applied to it. President Yahya Khan, who had governed Pakistan under martial law since the removal of Ayub Khan in 1969, was in China on a state visit when Bhola struck. He returned to Pakistan on November 14th, 2 days after landfall. He did not visit East Pakistan until November 22nd, 10 days after the storm. His first tour of the affected areas, conducted by helicopter, lasted less than a day. The visual record of that tour, photographs published in the Pakistani and international press, showed the president surveying the destruction from the air without landing in the most severely affected areas. The logistical problems facing any relief operation in the Delta were real and substantial. The destruction of boats, jetties, roads, and communication infrastructure in the most affected areas meant that reaching the chars required watercraft that were themselves in short supply in the days immediately following the storm. The East Pakistan government's administrative capacity, always limited relative to the scale of the province and its population, was further reduced by the deaths and displacements of its own personnel in the coastal districts. The relief supplies that began arriving at Chittagong port within days of the storm created congestion that the port's handling infrastructure could not quickly clear. These were genuine operational difficulties. What the operational difficulties do not explain is the 10-day gap before the country's president visited the affected area, the delay in formally requesting international assistance, and the pattern of public communications from the central government in the first weeks that systematically underestimated the death toll and the scale of the destruction. The British Royal Navy and Royal Air Force aircraft that conducted relief operations in the Delta from November 18th onward were able to reach communities that Pakistani military helicopters had not reached in the 6 days since the storm. American military helicopters from a naval vessel positioned in the Bay of Bengal began distribution of food and water to isolated chars from November 19th. The capacity existed. The decision to use it had been delayed.
International journalists who reached the Delta in the week after the storm found communities where survivors had been living for days on whatever food they had been able to salvage from the wreckage, without fresh water in many cases because the cisterns and wells of the chars had been contaminated by the surge. The bodies of the dead were still present in the fields and in the mud of the receded water. The living were caring for the injured, using whatever medical knowledge they had without medical supplies. The formal relief infrastructure had not yet reached them a week after the storm, and some of the most isolated chars were still waiting for the first contact with any relief organization when the journalists who documented their situation arrived. The inadequacy of the relief effort was not invisible to the people of East Pakistan.
It was reported extensively in the East Pakistani press, which in 1970 operated with a degree of independence that the political environment of martial law permitted but did not guarantee. The Ittifaq, the most widely read Bengali-language newspaper in Dhaka, published detailed accounts of the affected areas, the death toll estimates, and the relief operations in the weeks following the storm. Those accounts documented both the scale of the destruction and the inadequacy of the official response with a directness that the national press based in Karachi did not match. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was the leader of the Awami League, the dominant political party of East Pakistan, and was preparing his party for the December 7th elections. The election was the first general election Pakistan had held since independence, called by Yahya Khan as part of a managed transition from military rule. And it was an election that the Awami League was heavily favored to win in East Pakistan on the basis of its support for Bengali political and cultural rights. Rahman visited the affected areas before Yahya Khan did. His description of what he saw there was not the description of a neutral observer. He framed the cyclone's destruction and the relief effort's inadequacy within the political argument he had been making for years. That East Pakistan was treated by the central government as a resource to be exploited rather than a population to be served, and that the events of November of 1970 had demonstrated that argument with a finality that no subsequent denial could erase. The argument was not primarily wrong. The structural inequality between East and West Pakistan in 1970 was documented in government statistics that the Yahya Khan administration had itself produced. East Pakistan's lower share of development expenditure, its underrepresentation in the civil service and the military, the economic consequences of jute export revenues directed to a national treasury that returned a disproportionate share of its development spending to the Western wing. Rahman was making a political argument from a political position in advance of an election. He was also describing something real, The pattern of disparity that Rahman invoked in the weeks after the cyclone was real and documented. East Pakistan generated more than half of Pakistan's export earnings through its jute exports, but the central government's development budgets in the 1960s had directed the majority of investment to West Pakistan. The East Pakistani civil service and military were underrepresented relative to the population. The governor of East Pakistan in 1970 was a military appointee from West Pakistan, as all governors had been. The language of central government administration was Urdu, which was not the language of East Pakistan, where Bengali was spoken by virtually the entire population. The structure of the Pakistani state in 1970 was not a structure that treated its eastern wing and its western wing with equal political or economic weight. The cyclone of November 12, 1970, killed people for meteorological and geographic reasons. A powerful storm, a flat delta, a high tide, a sea that had nowhere to go but over the land. It killed them in the numbers it killed them, partly for reasons that were systemic. A warning system that was calibrated to reach urban and administrative centers rather than the most vulnerable rural population. An evacuation infrastructure that did not exist at the scale that the exposure of the Delta's population required. And a political structure that had not prioritized the investment in emergency preparedness for East Pakistan that the region's exposure to the Bay of Bengal's cyclone season had required for decades. The investment that would have reduced the death toll in November of 1970 was not a technically complicated investment. Cyclone shelters, elevated, reinforced structures capable of withstanding storm surge and high winds, were known to reduce mortality in cyclone-prone areas. The cost of building and maintaining a network of such shelters across the Delta's most exposed chars was calculable. It had not been calculated in any operational sense by the Pakistani government in the 23 years between independence and 1970, because the calculation required a prior decision to prioritize the survival of the Delta's population as an object of government investment, and that decision had not been made. What Yahya Khan's government invested in its eastern wing in the context of a national budget dominated by defense expenditure and West Pakistani infrastructure development was substantially less than the amount that a systematic program of cyclone preparedness would have required. The disparity was not accidental. It was the product of a political structure in which the decisions about national investment were made by a government dominated by West Pakistani military and civilian elites whose electoral constituency was not in the Delta. The December 7th elections proceeded as scheduled, less than 4 weeks after the storm. The Awami League won 160 of the 162 seats allocated to East Pakistan in the National Assembly, giving it a majority in the full national parliament. The victory was not only about Bhola. It was the accumulated product of 23 years of political grievance, economic inequality, linguistic suppression, and administrative marginalization, with the storm and the response to it providing a final, catastrophic demonstration of the relationship between East and West Pakistan that the election results then expressed with statistical precision. What followed from that election, the refusal of Yahya Khan's government to transfer power to the Awami League, the military crackdown of March of 1971, the Liberation War, the Indian intervention, and the independence of Bangladesh in December of 1971 was not caused by the Bhola cyclone. The conditions that produced it had been accumulating since 1947. But the storm was the event that made the gap between what the central government owed its eastern population and what it had delivered visible and undeniable in a way that no political speech, however accurate, could have produced. 500,000 people were dead. The president had taken 10 days to visit. The relief was late and insufficient. The election was 4 weeks away. The population of East Pakistan voted in the context of all of that. The count of the dead from the storm remained formally uncertain. 500,000 is the figure that Pakistani government sources produced by the end of the assessment period in 1970 and early 1971. The demographic analysts who studied the census records before and after produced ranges between 300,000 and 500,000.
The bodies of the drowned were not recovered in their majority. The sea and the rivers of the Delta took them. The chars where many had lived did not look the same afterward. Some names existed in no record that had survived. The figure of 500,000 is the figure that fits the evidence available, used with the understanding that precision in this case was destroyed along with the communities it would have counted.